too wide seen and beyond. I'm joining you today from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded Coast Salish territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people in Vancouver, British Columbia. Today's webinar, Too Wide Seen and Beyond, is the fourth dialogue in the Reconciling Ways of Knowing online forum series. We thank you all for joining us as we build towards an in-person conference, which will occur once the ongoing COVID-19 health pandemic subsides. Today's dialogue has been made possible by the generous support of our friends at the Canadian Mountain Network, who support the resilience and health of Canada's mountain peoples and places through research partnerships based on Indigenous and Western ways of knowing that inform decision-making and action. The Canadian Mountain Network's projects represent a once-in-a-generation opportunity to position Canada as the global leader in mountain system research at a time when Canada's mountain systems are undergoing rapid and uncertain change. To learn more, please visit them at www.canadianmountainnetwork.ca. Before I turn it over to our amazing speakers, I have a few quick housekeeping notes. We have turned the chat feature off and ask that you submit your questions through the question and answer box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. As we anticipate there will be a lot of questions, we will gather light questions for the moderator and do our best to address as many as we can and as time allows. Please submit your questions early. Please note that our speakers may have different Wi-Fi connections and volume levels based on their locations. We kindly request that you adjust your volume as needed. Today's dialogue will run approximately 90 minutes, and we are recording the dialogue so anyone who is unable to participate in the entire session can view it later online. It is now my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today, someone I am fortunate enough to call a friend, Jacquie Miller. Jacquie is one of the driving forces behind the Reconciling Ways of Knowing Indigenous Knowledge and Science Forum project. Through her tireless efforts, she has brought the vision and objectives of its advisory planning committee to fruition. She is a member of the inaugural cohort in the University of Victoria Faculty of Law's Joint Juris Doctor and Juris Indigenorum Doctor Program in Canadian Common Law and Indigenous Legal Orders. Jacquie received her Master of Arts degree in Political Science and Cultural, Social, and Political Thought from the University of Victoria and has extensive experience working with and in support of Indigenous peoples in BC, the North, and across Turtle Island. Without further ado, I'll pass it over to Jacquie Miller.
Thank you, Darren. I think before we get started today, I'd like to turn over to Dave Kershane, Elder Dr. Dave Kershane, to open our session up today in spirit. Dave, would you mind getting us started?
Thank you so much, Jacquie. Ujo anin dnemaganituk nigani aki inene nigo kinyon do dem saging donji inishinabe ndao. In the Indigenous world, we are constantly reminded of the spiritual realm. In our understanding, we believe in a higher power we have come to know as the Great Spirit. In prayer and ceremony, we acknowledge our gratitude for the gift of life. In our understanding, all life has a spirit, seen as a shining blue light. Mother Earth has a spirit, making her a living entity. And equally important to understand is that she also has an intelligence that guides us into balance. In that balance, there are four cardinal directions that reflect that there is spirit in each of these directions where the grandfathers sit. The spirit to help guide us spiritually in our lives. It is in the spirit I thank the Great Spirit for this engagement today as we continue to share knowledge. And very important also is being able to work together for a greater cause, our children. I say thank you, Mother Earth, for your continued unconditional love and providing our sustenance and knowledge to live a good life. We acknowledge her pain and hurt that she is going through because we have not followed the original instructions that we were given by the Great Spirit on how to live, how to behave, and not to show more kindness and compassion for all of life, and certainly for Mother Earth. I say thank you to the grandfathers of the 4 directions. I humbly ask that we all be guided today with good thoughts, and let the spirit of kindness prevail as we continue to work together. Miigwech. Thank you.
Thank you, Elder Dave, for founding our session today in spirit. Just like to make a note as well, Dave Kershane has been a founding convener of this Reconciling Ways of Knowing project, instrumental from the very beginning, including going back to when we held our opening 4 days of ceremony at the Turtle Lodge to get the planning process for this initiative underway in spirit and ceremony. And so thank you very much, Dave, for all that you do for the project and for starting us off today. Well, next, I just would like to acknowledge that I'm joining today from the territory of the Lekwungen peoples, about whose language, legal orders, and ways of knowing I'm working to learn more in my life, work, and studies. And thank you also to our technical team for your support in hosting today's session, and to our speakers and audience participants for your participation in joining us today. The title for today's dialogue, Two-Eyed Seeing and Beyond, is meant to reflect the fact that there are diverse ways of understanding across ways of knowing, and to reflect the fact that this conversation is also about how science education and knowledge production needs to change, decolonize, and to respect Indigenous knowledge, pedagogy, and learning processes. I'd like to briefly just acknowledge that we were hoping to have Mi'kmaq Elder Albert Marshall join us today, and at the moment it seems that he is not available. So for the time being, we're proceeding without him. If he is able to join us in the end, we'll be really happy to have him and come back to him at that point. And I'd like to introduce our other speakers that we have with us today, who we're really grateful to have join us today. So I'll start with Dr. Deborah McGregor. Dr. McGregor is Anishinaabe from the Whitefish River First Nation, an associate professor and Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Environmental Justice at York University's Osgoode Hall Law School and Faculty of Environmental Studies. Her research focuses on Indigenous knowledge systems and their application in diverse contexts, including environmental and water governance, environmental justice, health and environment, climate change, and Indigenous legal traditions. Dr. Jessie Popp is chair in Indigenous environmental science at the University of Guelph and a member of the Etuaptmumk unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Nation. Her research and teaching weaves Indigenous and Western ways of knowing to contribute to the advancement of environmental and ecological science, using a two-eyed seeing approach to understand changes to wildlife populations and their impacts to Indigenous people's ways of life. And Dr. Andrea Reid is a citizen of the Niska Nation from the village of Kingol, an incoming assistant professor with the University of British Columbia's Institute for Oceans and Fisheries, where she'll be the lead of the Indigenous Fisheries Research Unit. Her recently completed PhD in biology centered on multiple stressor effects on Pacific salmon, using tools and insights from Western and Indigenous sciences in tandem. My first question was for Elder Marshall, which I will turn first to Jessie and then Andrea, if they could speak to their knowledge of this question, given how much the concept of Etuaptmumk or two-eyed seeing has influenced their work. So if you could just get us started and tell us your understanding of where where the idea of two-eyed seeing came from, and how the role that it could play for young people, young Indigenous people, in their knowledge journeys and in reconciliation, or the relationship between Indigenous peoples and newcomers. Maybe we'll go with Jessie first.
Thanks, Jackie. I just want to start with saying Ani, Jessie Indigenous Wikwimkong Donjaba, Makwa Dodom, Anishinaabekwe, and Dao Miigwech. Hi everyone, I'm so honored and humbled to be here today with such a group of inspirational individuals. I want to start by saying Chimigwech, thank you to Elder Dave Kershay for opening this gathering in a good way. And of course to the organizers for putting this on and for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here. It wasn't so long ago that I really felt like I was standing alone in thinking that, you know, we could reconcile ways of knowing in science. Two-eyed seeing or other frameworks or conceptual frameworks for bringing together ways of knowing in science wasn't something I learned about in science, even though I had several degrees in biology. So I am a member of Wikwimkong unceded territory, although I didn't grow up in the community. I grew up in Northern Ontario, and I didn't get to have the elder teachings I would have liked to have as much, partly because my mom is part of the 60s Scoop, and because of her rather negative upbringing with foster care, she sort of shied away from culture. But I did sort of have a foot in two worlds, or at least a toe. So I always wondered how I could bring these worlds that I was part of into something that I was so passionate about, which was conservation biology and wildlife ecology. So because I didn't get to learn about any ways that you could bring ways of knowing together in my academic training, I started taking a journey of learning on my own. Started talking to elders and knowledge holders, started doing kind of what I knew best at the time with my Western academic training, is going through literature. That's where I came across terms like traditional ecological knowledge, two-eyed seeing from Elder Albert Marshall's paper, and even read Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass. So all of these things together really transformed my path from what I knew I always wanted to do, conservation ecology. You know, I now knew that the way that I wanted to move forward with this was through a path that brought together ways of knowing in support of reconciliation in Canada and in general. So two-eyed seeing is a concept, one conceptual framework of many, and I guess I'll let Andrea talk about that as well. But one conceptual framework for how we can bring together ways of knowing to better understand the world. So coined and described by Mi'kmaq Elder Albert Marshall, who I also hope can join us today, is that you can better understand the world through seeing through two eyes or two lenses. So one through Indigenous ways of knowing and seeing the world, and another through Western ways of knowing or seeing the world, because both of these ways of seeing the world can be complementary to one another. And so we can better see the world, and in my case, better understand ecology and ecological relationships. So a lot of the work that I do today takes a two-eyed seeing approach. And like many researchers across Canada now engaged in this type of work and across the world, for my field particularly, you can, like, some amazing things have been done by taking a two-eyed seeing or similar approach. So from things like optimizing wildlife monitoring, to understanding causes of species decline, to delineating populations and so on, the list goes on and on. In my work particularly, we have used two-eyed seeing to identify factors, negative impacts to species at risk, for example. Impacts that Western science had not previously known about. And so now identifying these impacts, we can work towards mitigating some of these negative impacts to help with conservation. Also taking a two-eyed seeing approach in some of the work I do to understand, you know, what factors are limiting declining wildlife species. So when I started out in this field, I thought that we when I started out in this field, I thought that I would be on the land all the time. That's something that's really important to me. But more and more with my particular position, I'm behind a computer, which many scientists are, which also I can, and many scientists can do many amazing, incredible things. So for example, taking environmental data and plugging them into models and predicting climate change impact and species population trajectories. But you miss so much by not being on the land. So with individuals who are on the land, who have incredible relationships with the land, intergenerational knowledge transfer, holistic insights through Indigenous knowledge systems, you know, that with Western science can be very complementary and can help us better understand the ecosystem linkages, interconnectivity, better engage in science, make science better, better our conservation strategies, and help us work together in ways that equally respect one another and each other's ways of knowing that are reciprocal. And by making science better, we can really tackle some of these enormous environmental issues facing us today.
Thank you, Jacquie. Andrea, would you mind speaking to your understanding? I know you've worked closely with Albert on a recent project, and you might be able to tell us something from your conversations with him, as well as your understanding of where two-eyed seeing came from and the relationship, or what you think the role that it can play in helping young Indigenous people in their learning paths, as well as in reconciliation or the relationship between Indigenous peoples and newcomers.
Yeah, thank you, Jacquie. So I'd just like to start by saying Neat, Willa Willana, hello, how are you? It really is such a pleasure to be here. I'm grateful to Elder Dave Corshane and to all of the organizers of this, Jacquie for hosting, and Jessie for really being the one to make space for me here. Jessie was the one to invite me on board, and I really appreciate having fellow colleagues a little bit further along in the trajectory, making space for early career folks like me. So I'm joining today from Algonquin Anishinaabe territory in Ottawa, Canada, where I just completed my PhD, which, as Jacquie said, centered on interweaving knowledges to better understand the fate and the state of Pacific salmon, which are very dear to my nation, the Nisga'a Nation in northern British Columbia. Jessie and I share a great deal of parallels, and like Jessie, for very similar reasons due to the residential school system and the 60s scoop, I didn't have the privilege of growing up in Nisga'a community or ceremony or culture, and I was actually raised in Mi'kma'ki on Abequid on Prince Edward Island, surrounded by ocean and fish and fisheries, and just grew up loving that, but very disconnected from that part of my heritage. And so for me, I think that two-eyed seeing, this idea to really bring together multiple ways of knowing, it really resonates with people in similar positions as Jessie and I, that are straddling multiple worlds, that have Western science training, but also see the power and the expertise that comes from within our communities. And there's this one really beautiful quote that I always love to turn to that I want to share with you, from A Mind Spread Out on the Ground by Alicia Elliott. It's such a wonderful read, and I really recommend people check out this book. But in it, she says, "Being both Haudenosaunee and white wasn't a curse meant to tear me in two. It was a call to uphold the different responsibilities that come with each part of me. I don't need to worry about whether to get in the boat or the canoe, and I certainly don't need to drown in between. Understanding and honoring my unique responsibilities was always the way to keep myself afloat." And I really think that two-eyed seeing has that ability, that power to allow us to take the best of both worlds to contend with really big ecological issues that we're facing now. So it's been a delight to get to connect with Jessie, Deb, and Elder Albert in this work, and to see that we're not siloed and alone in taking this on. For me, I wasn't taught about two-eyed seeing in any formal way. I never heard about it in school. It was something that I organically arrived at through my research on fish and fisheries and making myself useful to my community. I was able to reconnect with Niska culture and community. And in doing that, I wanted to find ways to interweave knowledge systems. And so I was seeking a framework. I was seeking that kind of validation. So like Jacquie, through literature review and as well as through contacts, I was able to find out about two-eyed seeing. And because the Indigenous scholarship world is small, it turned out that Albert and I have many people in common, especially with my growing up in Mi'kma'ki. And I was able to connect with Albert, and I started out by first just watching his clips that are available on the Integrative Science website for Cape Breton University, and saw his powerful way of speaking. And then I asked if we could engage and have a few conversations. And from our first conversation, he just immediately took an hour out of his time to share immense wisdom over the phone. And I was just not even prepared for that conversation. I wound up just surrounded by notes on the floor. I was scribbling to keep up with all of his ideas, and he was so willing to share. And Albert really sees so much power in equipping the next generation to think like this and to know that this framework exists. And he spends a lot of time engaging youth in these ways, as do I, but I'm a lot less further along in my trajectory than he is. And I'm sure that he is occupied with other responsibilities as he's a very busy man at this moment, but I know that he was very excited to join in on this conversation and wants it to be part of this national conversation. But so through my connection with Albert, we were able to produce a paper together that was recently published in the journal Fish and Fisheries about how two-eyed seeing can really transform how we study and manage our fisheries in Canada and around the world. And in this paper, we look at, Jacquie alluded to this, that there are many Indigenous conceptual frameworks that allow us to pair multiple ways of knowing in equitable ways. And so I just wanted to quickly share one of the main figures from this paper. Just give me 1 second. You can see it, great. So this figure shows 4 different Indigenous conceptual frameworks for reconciling ways of knowing. The one that's in the top left corner, labeled number 1, the Etuaptmumk, and Deb McGregor, who we're delighted to have here today too, she will be speaking further to this, so I won't tread in those waters. Numbers 2 and 3, they stem from Australia and New Zealand, where the Yolngu and the Maori have very equivalent kinds of ways of thinking about bringing together distinct knowledge systems so that they can interact and interface and innovate and create new solutions to problems, but they don't disrupt the integrity of the other. They remain separate and come together temporarily to work on a common goal. And it's very much like the concept of two-eyed seeing. And so I think just the last thing I want to say on this subject while we get this going is that Albert is really adamant that he is a carrier of this knowledge. He did not dream up two-eyed seeing. It is a tradition that has been carried through Mi'kmaq culture, and it really embraces this conservation ethic called Decolonizing, which is really about conserving our natural world, looking ahead 7 generations and back 7 generations. And so it's really a teaching that we all have a responsibility to once we have the privilege of knowing more about it. And I wish Albert was here to share more with us, but maybe he'll be able to join soon, but I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. I'd like to also ask Deb to weigh in on this one. I know that she's done a lot of research in this general area, and I'd like to just ask her thoughts about her knowledge of where the idea came from, its role for helping Indigenous youth in their learning paths, as well as in the relationship between Indigenous peoples and newcomers.
Thank you, Jackie, and Andrea, and Jesse's comments as well. Yeah, thank you for inviting me to be part of this. And the opening that we received is really touched by that in terms of recognizing that the Earth also has its own agency and intelligence. I'm fortunately in my own territory. Usually when I introduce myself, I say, oh, I'm from White Fisher and I live in Toronto, but actually I can look out the window and see the trees and the lake, which is actually kind of nice, rather than more great, big, huge, horrible buildings being built all over the place around me. But when I'm in the city. So actually I came across this concept about 20 years ago, and actually from a presentation that Albert Marshall and some of other folks from his community were presenting, and surprisingly, it was actually part of an initiative by the DFO, Department of Ocean and Fisheries, who appear to be not necessarily getting along with Mi'kmaq at the moment. And because they were trying to develop an Indigenous, they were at the time they were calling it Aboriginal traditional knowledge, so the terminology has always changed over time. In terms of their work. So it was after the Marshall decision. And so they were trying to figure this out. They were trying to look at different models for how at the time Aboriginal traditional knowledges would be considered in the work in very science-based departments like DFO. And they knew that the extractive model of going about interacting with Indigenous peoples and Indigenous knowledge was not something that Indigenous peoples wanted. So what were some other ways of thinking about Indigenous knowledge? And so the way that what I came away from that was not, because I think it's very easy at that time, because this was new, like the research before that, usually conducted by non-Indigenous scholars, utilizing their own theories and paradigms. But what the two-eyed seeing offered was a different theoretical and conceptual framework for how to think about knowledge systems. So it wasn't just, some old people talking about these ideas. It was actually theory. It was actually about how we understand knowledge and how we want to interact with knowledge and how different peoples can relate to each other in relation to knowledge. A lot of I find non-Indigenous research frameworks and science don't do that, because it's all about the science and the data and collecting it and putting it in models. And so this offered a framework that could be scaled, because you could do that in the two-eyed seeing, but it was also about a relationship between people. So it's not odd for Jackie to ask that question about what can this inform us about reconciliation and relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. This theoretical and conceptual framework can actually inform that. So that's when I was first introduced to this for 20 years ago. And then I don't think it really, after a few years of a big push, as governments change, champions change, they leave, and then things kind of fell by the wayside. But I'd been familiar with it for some time, and it's actually been formally adopted as part of the CAHR process for the Canadian Institute of Health Research. Like, that's how they expect science-based health research to be conducted. And having been part of those adjudication processes, like, people interpret it very, very differently, I think, sometimes at different scales. But so for me, I found the philosophy also behind it very appealing as well. Having been in a science-based faculty when I was doing my PhD in forestry, I found the reaction by a lot of the other students and actually the faculty was that they were sort of threatened kind of by the whole idea of Aboriginal traditional knowledge or tech or Indigenous knowledge, whatever terminology people are choosing to use, and somehow saw that as being a rejection of science. And so, because they weren't familiar with any kind of Indigenous conceptions, theoretical frameworks, they weren't educated either. So they had no idea. They just kind of thought, oh, well, like, look at these other knowledge and it's like primitive and, it's going to displace our knowledge. But this two-eyed seeing was, I think, to some extent comforting for them, because it didn't require them to reject their training and everything that they knew. Andrea and Jesse talked about this, that it was actually going to embrace other knowledge into this, into trying to solve whatever the common problem was that was being defined to deal with. So I think to some extent it was a comfort to them to realize that, because I found that was sort of like literally I had to feel that question a lot. I'm like, no, that isn't what it means at all. It means that literally you're going to have to learn how to get along with like Indigenous people, because that's actually where the knowledge is. It's not like somewhere floating out there in some database. It's actually embedded within people and within the community. So that was sort of how I became familiar with it. And to me, it was really important for young Indigenous scholars, as Jacquie and Andrea pointed out, because you don't want to be, you want to solve, or you want to assist with solving these big challenges that are facing Indigenous peoples, the planet, as well as if we respect it in the way that Elder Crashane talked about it, as a living being with agency and intelligence as well. It's not just about people, that we would that we need to embrace Indigenous ways of thinking about these kind of questions and people. It isn't just about getting the knowledge from people and then forgetting about them and then working on them, and the two-eyed seeing enabled for this interchange and interaction to occur. The other thing that probably at the time, like probably now people might frame the two-eyed seeing approach this way, but really what it was initially 20 years ago and the kind of impact that it's had, what it does is it decolonizes research. It sort of disrupts the power that Western knowledge has over Indigenous knowledge by saying that that Indigenous knowledge is equally valid. So that's an assumption of it, is that Indigenous knowledge is important, significant, and valid, because that's not a lot of people's understanding of Indigenous knowledge. So that's one of its assumptions, is that there's something to offer from people and Indigenous knowledge systems. So in that way, it's a decolonizing approach, because it challenges a lot of the current status quo, and which is why it's also really important for it to be like explicitly kind of recognized. The other part of the two-eyed seeing that I learned over the last couple of decades is it doesn't always just apply to Western science and Indigenous knowledge. I remember being in a meeting, and it was actually different Indigenous nations can also engage in the two-eyed seeing approach, right? Because you have to recognize also that Indigenous peoples are very diverse. Their nations, their whole societies, they had their own knowledge systems, languages, everything. And sometimes, we would interact with each other, and we had ways of doing that. So the two-eyed seeing just wasn't invented by the Mi'kmaq upon encountering settlers and colonizers. They had this concept long before that. So it was there as part of the history and the way of being long before these other encounters. So I guess what I'm saying is that we already had these ways of how we wanted different knowledges to interact with each other, how different peoples were going to respectfully interact with each other, starting from the assumption that these knowledge systems have something to offer, and it's not appropriate for one to dominate the other. I think for young people, and I'll end with this because there's a lot more to say and we have other questions to attend to, is that I think for a lot of young people going into science, and there's been many stories, some that are different, I think, than what Jacquie and Andrea had, where they happen to find something, right? Is that they're sometimes in a position where they feel like they have to give up their identity. They're facing situations where, well, this isn't kind of the stories that my elders say as they're learning something. So the two-eyed seeing, what it does is they don't have to do that. They don't have to be in that compromising position. They can go, oh, well, I'm learning this other knowledge from elders in my community, from my parents and from my family, and it's important and it's valid and it has something to offer, as well as getting my science degree at whatever level. So it's, I think, comforting for a lot of young people to not feel like they're being compromised in that way, because I hear a lot of stories about that too. And a lot of people leave science for that reason. Like they're having to grapple with this. So it needs to be kind of recognized as a theoretical and conceptual framework as well, because that's what it is. It's a theory of how knowledges interact with each other. And because of the advocacy of Albert and others, and scholars like Jacquie and Andrea, that the idea is now talked about, like in classrooms and taught, right? And so that was a lot of work to do that. It didn't just happen. So it's and we have a lot more work to do in terms of how to figure out how it's going to happen at different levels, and how that interchange is going to happen in different places, or how it happens when there just isn't Indigenous scholars always available to be part of those conversations, because there's more of us, but there isn't enough of us always to be part of all of the conversations that need to happen. So, so I'll end there. Hopefully that was helpful in shedding some insight into that. So Chimigwech.
Thanks, Deb. Very helpful, actually. And thank you, each of you, for helping us kind of create a foundational understanding of the idea of Etuaptmumk, or two-eyed seeing. And I just wanted to pick up on your comment, Deb, that a core part of the theory that's been picked up, I think it's had a long evolution, but that's been picked up, is the recognition of Indigenous knowledges as equally valid, and that's not necessarily been a common understanding. And what I'd just like to pick up on there is that that's been a core purpose of why this whole initiative of reconciling ways of knowing is here, is to just create space for that conversation, in the effort to decolonize the power relationships between Indigenous knowledge and Western knowledge, where Western knowledge puts itself above as essentially the only valid form that we can obtain knowledge from, when in fact there are multiple ways of knowing. I think at this point, quickly, I will just turn back to you, Deb, before we move into a few of the other more applied questions, because I know that you've done a lot of research into some other frameworks for thinking across ways of knowing, and it'd be good to flesh that out a little bit before diving into some applied questions. And so would you be able to tell us a little bit more about how you use the idea of the Geswenta or two-row wampum, and the dish with one spoon, and other frameworks for thinking across ways of knowing? And maybe just a quick recap on what those are for anyone who might not have the knowledge on that.
Thank you. Andrea's image pointed to some of them. Some of the different ideas. So I think part of the underlying assumption that I come from with this is that there are Indigenous nations. They were here for thousands of years, and they had different ways of how they interacted with each other as nations, and we had our own theories. Like, theory isn't just, again, something invented by people in universities. Like, we had our own ways of how we are going to explain meaning in our lives, and how we are going to for lack of a better word, I'll say advanced knowledge. Because again, pointing to some of the comments that Elder Dave Crushane said, like, there were times in our history when we had to face destruction, and it's usually because we weren't behaving properly in relation to the natural and the spirit world, or all of creation as, you know, an intelligent kind of living being. So we developed our own ideas and theories and philosophies and knowledge and legal orders and societies around this. And there's huge diversity, which to me is amazing. Like that we're able to do that. So different nations developed different ways of how they were going to interact with other nations and societies' knowledge systems. So when you come from that assumption, you know that there's going to be more, right? You know that there's Haudenosaunee are going to have their own, even within their own confederacy, and then how they might have it with the Anishinaabeg that you might see in the One Spoon treaty, or in the Geswenta, the two-row wampum treaty. So when you start from that assumption, it makes sense that there's going to be different ideas or conceptual or theoretical frameworks around this. So the Geswenta is, and I'm not Haudenosaunee, but I'll speak to it, like how I became familiar with this concept. And it was in work I was doing in the Great Lakes, particularly the State of the Great Lakes Ecosystem Report, and it's very science-based. So coming out from Environment Canada, Ministry of the Environment provincially, and then different states in the US as part of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, they were trying to figure out how to work with Indigenous peoples and Indigenous knowledge, and really kind of didn't have a clue to go about how to do that. And I had been working with a lot of Indigenous communities around the Great Lakes to figure out, okay, what can this look like? They were for sure rejecting the idea that Indigenous knowledges from whichever communities were going to be just simply assimilated and integrated into other people's knowledge systems. They'd already been through that. They didn't like it because they said people go ahead, make decisions without them being involved. So they wanted what are some different ideas about how to go about this work. James Ransom, who's Mohawk from Akwesasne, Mohawks of Akwesasne, he was the former director of environment for the Assembly of First Nations, introduced me to the idea of the Geswenta. And it's actually a treaty originally between the Haudenosaunee and the Dutch for how they were going to function together as societies, that they weren't going to interfere with one another in the model that Andrea, you could just show the image. That's probably a better way to to try to explain it. And but there were fundamental principles involved in that particular treaty. You weren't going to interfere with each other. You weren't going to require people to be something that they weren't. So you can also see it in the image that she put up in terms of the canoe and the ship, and also the treaty belt that has the 3 white rows and the 2 purple rows. And people were going to approach these, how they were going to work together in peace and friendship, and that they weren't going to interfere. They weren't going to interfere with each other. So what they were doing is respecting each other's autonomy. So I kind of understood this as a treaty. It took some time for me to kind of understand that this actually had to do with knowledge systems. He's actually written a really neat article on environmental assessment and how to use the Geswenta in terms of how different knowledge systems can interact with each other. So what it means, and Andrea touched on this in her opening remarks as well, is that what it enables, or what it reinforces, or one of the assumptions, is that the integrity of the knowledge systems remain. There's no absorbing into another knowledge system and then it becomes something that it's not, because that has happened, unfortunately, a lot with Indigenous knowledge, appropriation of Indigenous knowledge. People retain their own autonomy and their own governance over their own knowledge, which is actually a thing right now, right? Like Indigenous research, self-determination, data sovereignty. This was already embedded. Like these new ideas coming out over the last decade or so are actually already embedded within this concept of the Geswenta and the Etuaptmumk. And because of that, it actually influenced my PhD research, because at the time there wasn't really like frameworks for how to deal with different knowledge systems. I was in a faculty where people thought I was rejecting science. I'm like, well, being in a science-based faculty seems like a very weird place to decide to do that. So that was my first thought bubble, is I'm like, well, this is a weird place to decide to reject science. And so, but people were more comfortable with the idea of the Geswenta. What they struggled with was the assumption that it was a distinct knowledge system that you didn't have to tinker with in order for it to be valuable. But I utilized it in my work, influenced by the Haudenosaunee people that I was working with, because I needed to be able to convey that Indigenous knowledge can stand on their own. They always did, and they can continue to do so. And that we would bring the best that we have to offer to the situation at hand. So in the image that Andrea showed, you're on a river. So part of the metaphor is that the river is something that we share, which could be the planet, could be geographically, maybe the area that we're around, but we care about that because we rely on it to live. So what do we have? What's the best that we have to offer to try to resolve this common situation, problem, or challenge that we're facing? So that's sort of in essence what the Geswenta does, and it's one that's geared more towards, I guess, dealing with settlers, but not exclusively. There are actually there's all kinds of other wampums that were used to interact with other nations as well, which is in one instance the dish at one spoon that I also see as another way of another Indigenous knowledge, I guess, theoretical framework. So the dish at one spoon treaty is one between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabeg, as we were in conflict, and it was the treaty that brought peace, because we both wanted peace. And what it does is it enables the sharing of knowledge. And with each other to, again, how are we going to sustain the resources or the land, the creation that we share? How are we going to support that? How are we going to ensure the sustainability for future generations? How are we going to honor that? And that treaty informs that process. So the Haudenosaunee would bring, again, the best that they have to offer, the knowledge that they have to offer, and so would the Anishinaabeg, in order to ensure the sustainability of the I hate necessarily, I don't always like to use the word resources, of the I guess of the lands and creation that we actually coexist with. So to me, I saw that one as one where Indigenous nations would also be interacting with each other, and it still happens, right? So Indigenous scholars, I could be working specifically with Haudenosaunee communities and be utilizing the Dish at One Spoon tree. Actually, probably the two-eyed seeing as well. Like, it doesn't always have to be always in relation to Western science. So I guess that's one of the other things I always want to say, is that Indigenous knowledges were here for thousands of years, and they functioned on their own or in relation to in other Indigenous nations. They always changed over time, because we had these different challenges that Elder Dave Crashane talked about in his opening prayer and remarks. And it was good to learn from other people in order to ensure sustainability, to ensure actually the objective of the Anishinaabe is the continuance of life. That's actually why you're trying to gain knowledge, is the continuance of life. And so those are ones that I work with quite a bit, because I'm interested in the continuance of life and what we have to offer to be able to do that. And Indigenous knowledge have thousands of years on these territories. They can stand on their own, and they continue to stand on their own, but how are we going to relate to other knowledge systems that can also help us address some of the big challenges of the day? So that was probably long-winded, but that's sort of how I've kind of work with the two concepts. And I think what's interesting, you don't see this as much in the even in the Indigenous research scholarship, is the understanding of how treaties interrelate and how they can find meaning in terms of scale, and in how knowledge systems are going to interact. I think we're just starting to kind of see that, and I think it helps with that broader question of Indigenous, non-Indigenous relations and reconciliation. I'll stop there. That was kind of long-winded. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I think another, just to tie it into reconciling ways of knowing as well, and where we came from, like, I think it's a great connection. One of the ideas that we've had for the project is that this is part of the nation-to-nation relationship that a lot of people have been talking about. There's been a federal government talking about it, and Indigenous peoples have been talking about it for quite a long time, and pushing for going back to the understanding of a nation-to-nation relationship. But that this includes far more than just relationships between governments, but relationships between the ways of being and the ways of knowing of the peoples. That's far deeper than just governments. I think in light of the time, we have, I would say, about 10 more minutes before we should shift over, and I have two other questions. So I'll just give you a quick preview on what they are, and then we can dive into them. So the first one is just to ask the people that are doing applied research using these frameworks. So I'll go with Jacquie, and then Andrea, and Deb, if you've got some comments to add. How you use Etuaptmumk or two-eyed seeing or two-road wampum or other frameworks for thinking across ways of knowing in your applied work. And then the second question will be, and perhaps you can integrate them if you like, but I think they are distinct questions. How basically these frameworks are more than mere tools that allow Indigenous knowledge to be used as a resource, just to help people understand that in fact they're tools that inherently require ethical relation, responsibility, reciprocity, and partnership. I think maybe let's start with the first one about how do you use it in your applied work, and then we'll come to the ethical obligations. So we'll start with Jacquie.
Thanks, Jacquie. Yeah, and I'll try to answer both of those questions right now. So yeah, so I kind of touched on some of the work that I'm doing in the research that we do right now. What I do is a lot of wildlife ecology work. So I'm just one of many scholars who are using a two-eyed seeing approach in ecological research. And again, lots of really great, incredible things happening. And I mentioned too that, I once felt like I was standing alone and thinking of reconciling ways of knowing, but more and more I learn and be part of gatherings like this. I get to hear about the exciting projects that are happening everywhere. So it's really great to be part of this momentum of change. So one of the exciting parts of this work to me as well is trying to understand the best ways to do this, the best ways to interweave ways of knowing in ecological research. And that's a question that a lot of people have. We know that this is important to take this approach because we're making science better, we're addressing problems better, we're building better partnerships. But how do we do this? So there are a lot of examples, for example, in the scientific literature, but even within communities. So actually with some work that I'm actually doing right now with Deb and in partnership with other communities and universities, we're reaching out to First Nation communities Indigenous communities across Canada, Turtle Island, and asking what are some ways that you bring together ways of knowing in wildlife monitoring and management, for example, as well as bringing in Western scientific literature for examples of what other researchers have done. So using a two-eyed seeing approach just to try to understand ways that we can do this in our work, but also to prioritize ways that we can do this in our work in a respectful, reciprocal, responsible way. There has been a very poor history of engagement with Indigenous communities in the past through science, through researchers or consultants, trying to take Indigenous knowledge almost to check a box, maybe being told, well, this project has to have an Indigenous knowledge component. So people coming in and trying to check a box, which is wrong. And Deb might be able to elaborate on this more, but this is, you don't just take knowledge. We have to ensure that we are engaging with communities in a meaningful way for those not part of community. So we have to ensure that whatever we're doing in terms of two-eyed seeing, let it be ecological research or other type of work, that we're doing it in a good way. And Robin Wall Kimmerer uses a braid of sweetgrass as a metaphor in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass. And I like to think about, when I think about research and two-eyed seeing or other frameworks, I like to think about a braid. So when you have, for example, Indigenous ways of knowing, Western ways of knowing, or different nations, and you try to braid those two strands together, if you let go, the braid will unravel. So I think that you need that third strand in there of doing things in a good way to build that strong relationship, to be successful and have a strong braid. So there's a lot of things that we should be thinking about. But for example, being respectful, reciprocal, and responsible. So respecting each other's knowledge systems, and Jacquie, you touched on this, as equally valuable and important ways of knowing and seeing the world. Respecting, as Deb was mentioning, respecting the integrity of each other's knowledge systems, and being reciprocal. So ensuring that you're not just taking, that you're always giving back, especially to communities, but also to the earth. So definitely a lot of things to think of, and also, for example, something important to think about is Indigenous values. So how can work maybe that outside people coming in doing with communities, how can we ensure that we're building meaningful relationships, ensure that we're prioritizing values, maybe things like ensuring there's intergenerational knowledge transfer or elder and youth involvement, or many different things. So there's a lot of things to think about, and I think when thinking about what I would like to see more in science, as I wasn't even really exposed academically to two-eyed seeing in general, but as this movement happens and more people are being part of reconciling ways of knowing, that we ensure that we interweave doing things in a good way, and that we keep that in the conversation as well. So with that, I'll stop there.
Great, thank you, Jacquie. Andrea, would you like to touch on this? Firstly, how you use these frameworks for thinking and understanding across ways of knowing in your applied work, and if you want to tie the two together, also the ethical responsibility, relations, reciprocality, and partnership that is inherently involved in using these frameworks.
Absolutely, thank you. Yeah, Jacquie, you gave an excellent preface on many of these topics, so I'll jump right into just giving a few applied examples from my own work. So the paper that I shared earlier, that is actually one of the central chapters of my PhD thesis, which really employed two-eyed seeing as a guiding framework. And like Jacquie said, it is so not a box checking exercise of you need a certain amount of this and a certain amount of this and you're going to achieve two-eyed seeing. It's really a reflexive practice that we can carry with us through the lifetime of a project, and to use it as a guiding principle at every research choice and action, and at every turn, basically, to guide how we move forward in the work in a good way. And so as one example that actually comes from my nation, my nation has been employing amazing co-management strategies for nearly 3 decades, in which they have very successfully married traditional methodologies for understanding our fisheries and for monitoring them, alongside of modern statistical approaches. And so in my work in partnership with the nation, I combine radio telemetry, where I put radio tags inside of salmon to see where they go, how quickly they get there, if they reach their spawning grounds, to see if there are things we can do, things in the environment that can be improved to make sure that more reach spawning grounds. So I use this really quantitative approach, but I pair that with methodologies that are employed by the Nisga'a Nation, such as big fish wheels that are on the river and weirs that give us this opportunity to recapture my tagged fish. And so we can do health assessments on these fish as they're migrating through time and space. And so this gives us a different kind of insight, and their Nisga'a fish technicians are very actively assessing the health and well-being of these fish based on their knowledge and understanding of what the fish ought to look like at that point in time, and how they should be doing. And so I get to bring together these qualitative and these quantitative ways of knowing together to improve our understanding for the state of our fish. Another example from within the context of my thesis is that I performed 2 kind of expert evaluation assessments in my thesis that looks at leading threats to freshwater ecosystems and the fish that inhabit them. And on one end of that work, I worked with freshwater scientists from around the world to evaluate key threats and identify what those main considerations are. And we used data in that work from the World Wildlife Fund on all monitored populations of vertebrates in freshwater, marine, and terrestrial systems to look at how they've done over time between the 1970s and today. On the other end of this work, I interviewed elders and knowledge keepers from across the province of British Columbia about key threats that are endangering our salmon and what we can do about them, asking them how their access to the fish has changed since that same time frame, since the 1970s to the present day. And what I find fascinating is that they both find this staggering decline that is of the same magnitude. Both find an average of 83% decline over this 50-year time frame, which is a really big cause for concern that we're seeing these fish, these waterways being deprecated to a point of 1/6 of what they used to be and what we used to know them as. And I just love that, like, you can do this big global monitoring of all the populations of freshwater vertebrates on the planet, or you can talk to people who live and know the fish and live in that way, and we arrive at the same value. And so I think it just really goes to show that we can learn from both of these ways, and they're both accurate, precise, and valuable. So I just wanted to share those 2. And then in terms of ethical considerations, I want to leave room for Deb here because she has so much insight to share in this space and has written a beautiful book on this subject that I encourage others to check out. But how we move through this work in a good way, it really comes down to thinking about these things as unending processes. I have another figure that I'm going to share quickly from the paper that shows some of the considerations in this kind of work, that when we engage in research or management of resources, or however we want to term that, when we're talking about the natural world and everything in creation, that it comes from a place of community identified needs, that the research interest or the management interest is shared between all parties kind of involved in that, that projects are co-run, co-evaluated, that benefits from the work are equally shared for everyone involved, and that these are really positioned as long-term relationships. A colleague of mine, Gahante Horn-Miller, always talks about research relationships as lifetime commitments, and I really think that that's true. There's not a clear beginning and an end. And so I'm going to leave it there and turn things over to Deb.
Great, thanks, Andrea. Over to you, Deb, with your thoughts on applied work and ethical responsibilities.
Well, in terms of the applied work, one of the projects that I had worked on recently was source water protection. A lot of my work is also Indigenous water justice and governance at the community level, and having to work with different knowledge systems, because we're provincially, they already have set source water protection sort of processes and how you identify threats. So we're trying to figure out actually how to kind of make this work or not work. And it really wasn't. So we kind of had to basically create something new. It wasn't that the provincial source water protection process wasn't important. It's considered one of the most rigorous in the world. It did have really important structures and questions to be asking, but it was very much geared to more the southern Ontario and more geared towards like municipalities, not like the kind of situation that like most Indigenous peoples, particularly First Nations, are in. So we basically had to create a whole new process that would work at the community level. And in it, we worked a lot with what we were calling traditional and community knowledge, because you also have to recognize in a lot of communities, due to the colonial processes that Jacquie and Andrea already talked about, some people aren't necessarily comfortable with that terminology for various reasons. So we said with traditional and community knowledge, because people say, well, I have community knowledge, but I don't know about that traditional knowledge stuff, right? Because people sometimes don't have a lot of confidence in their own knowledge. So one of the first things you do is you have to delineate your like the watershed areas, but people already knew that. People who fish, people who hunt, they already kind of knew what those areas were. And for me, that's where I started, because I found that easier to do than actually trying to find the maps, actually trying to find the maps for this, because unless a municipality was already mapping this out as part of their own source water protection plan, they didn't exist in a way you could work with communities. So they already knew where the watersheds were in terms of that was influencing the community. So that's sort of how we operated in terms of that. Was out, and actually in this case we would always start with the community and the traditional knowledge, because we found it helped us know where to look for the Western science stuff actually, because it was too big, or then it was also helpful in identifying where the gaps were. Because surprisingly, Manitoulin doesn't have a source water protection plan. We're like, what? It's like an island and a Great Lakes and fresh. What do you mean it doesn't have one? So it was helpful for us to kind of know where to look for information and where the gaps were, and where we basically had to rely on traditional and community knowledge to fill in those gaps, because it didn't exist in the Western science kind of realm. And it really actually changed how I thought about doing this kind of work, because people answered the questions in ways that I wasn't thinking, maybe because I was so embedded within working on this for so many years in provincial and federal contexts, that I always thought about water as just like H2O, but it's not. Like people said, actually, we travel mostly in the winter when there's ice because it's faster. You can go, And people get water from like ice and snow. So I just thought, oh, like, you know what, those processes don't deal with that very well, like how people actually understand and work with water in its different form. So it really changed that and broadened sort of, I think, the typical understanding of water and how you would go about source water protection. The other thing is they got kind of challenged that whole idea of like source water protection and that just being something that human and resource managers do, but actually more of a coexistence and a caretaking kind of relationship. So those are some examples of how we worked with different knowledges within that, and both were important because we wanted to be able to influence what other people were doing in relation to water. So we needed to be able to say, this is what we're doing, and this is how you're influencing the water quality and quantity in the communities. So it needed to be in a way that people outside of the community could understand, and actually be helpful for them, because a lot of them didn't have source water protection planning processes in place. So that's one example, and it kind of leads me to the second half of the question in terms of relationships. So I'll just briefly tell you this story about how I think about this, and I think Andrea did a great and like read that paper, because that image that she showed is like really important. It's not like a linear thing. You got to let go of the linear thing, and that it's a constant cycle of relationships, because all of us are old enough to be in relationships, and relationships require work and often constant negotiation, because sometimes we're not going to agree, and you got to be able to work through those disagreements. Like dissent can also be generative and productive. So like any kind of relationship, you've got to be able to get through those bumps too, instead of throwing up your hand saying, I'm not doing this anymore. Like there's these other principles at play that keep you committed to the relationship. But this was actually an insight shared by Métis scholar Zoe Todd, and we were, I still remember this, like I can even picture in my head what it looked like in the room and who was there. That's how much of an impact it had on me. And we were asked this question about Indigenous knowledge within the Academy, how to respect it, because it's increasingly so, but nowhere near other knowledges in universities and governments and other spaces. It's constant hard work by Andrea, Jessica, Albert, people like us, and others probably who are part of this conversation and part of this whole planning committee, to constantly push. And then everyone went around the room about what we thought needed to happen. And Zoe Todd just said, you have to be ready. You have to be ready for us and our knowledge. If you're not, it's not going to happen. You have to be ready. You have to do the work of being ready to be able to listen and treat Indigenous peoples and us with respect, and with our knowledge. So the onus isn't always on Indigenous peoples, that there actually has to be a lot of this work that also has to occur, and people have to be ready. And I haven't seen a lot on, particularly in the academic literature, that actually provides a lot of guidance for natural and applied scientists for how to work in good ways with Indigenous peoples. Jesse and I are talking about how can we work on that? What can we do? There is a recent paper that was recently published in Facets Journal by a number of folks out of the Yukon that listed 10 principles that you should know as a scientist in working with Indigenous peoples and Indigenous knowledge. Probably one of the only ones that I've seen that explicitly says this is what you need to do in order to make sure that you're relevant and appropriate and ethical in your conduct and in your relationships with Indigenous peoples. And where it kind of really struck home again was I was delivering a water workshop with youth in an internship program on Manitoulin, and they were mostly kind of being trained by technicians and scientists, which is fine. Like they were also learning about ceremonies and traditional knowledge. And I went in and talked about how we did the source water protection plan, and Indigenous knowledge around water. And the technicians and scientists were kind of agitated and upset. And then they said to me, why haven't like you people been sharing this knowledge with us all along? I've been around enough to like kind of keep my cool with those kind of questions, but it was kind of annoying. But anyway, and I started, we've been telling you for decades, for centuries. This isn't new, what I'm telling you. The literature exists. We've been saying this. You haven't been ready. You haven't been ready to hear what we had to say. You haven't been ready to hear what Dave Crushane has shared and part of his opening remarks around recognizing the earth as being living, having agency, and having intelligence, because that's a different, when you come from that place, you think about these questions very differently. And I'll just end on the idea of reconciliation. And this also is interesting because it comes from, it's in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and you can find it in the summary report. And a lot of it actually drawing on Mi'kmaq traditions, because they talk about how you have to know knowledge and legal orders and philosophy and protocols to really kind of advance reconciliation in Canada. And then this one section, and because I have like that environment kind of lens, that's kind of what I see everywhere, is they basically said, it's very hard to achieve reconciliation among people unless we also address reconciliation with the land and creation itself. We always have to think beyond the human dimension. And they're very explicit about that. And I think that's where Indigenous knowledge can really make those kind of contributions to our understanding, because that's what's gonna get us there. So it's not just reconciliation among people, it's also with the natural world, our ancestors and future generations as well. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Deb, Andrea, and Jackie for your responses on both of those questions and our panel discussion so far. At this point, I'll call on the RWAC conveners that we have today to add any comments or questions that they have, and then we'll move over to some questions from the audience that have been coming in that I've got a note of, and we'll draw on some of them. We've got some overlapping themes. I think first, Miles, if you're ready, I know that you are going to have to get going to another commitment soon. So I'll ask you if you want to give your comment or question first.
I just want to thank the presenters. It was a fascinating discussion, and I'm, continue following Dr. Kimmerer's presentation on braiding sweetgrass. I've really got some valuable insight today on approaches, how we might manifest cooperation and having these two ways of knowing work together. Jesse talked about 3 strands to the braid: Western science, Indigenous traditional knowledge, but in order to implement them, in order to make them real, you needed the blade, the strand of ceremony, proper ceremony. That brings me back, I get involved, I'm in politics all the time, Dave Crushane is trying to heal me of that, but that's kind of the world I've lived in. And we think about how two-eyed seeing could help develop this nation-to-nation relationship. And I'd ask each of you if you have any insights onto that. When the Western knowledge came to Turtle Island through the power of the British Crown, and as the British Crown was struggling for legitimacy in Turtle Island, they made a couple of promises. They promised through the Royal Proclamation of 1763, committed that again at the Treaty of Niagara the following year, basically to a nation-to-nation relationship of equals, where the operative mechanism was consent between these nations. We've got so far away from that. Denying Indigenous knowledge, as you've each laid out so clearly, and just insisting on the Western way. And it's got us into all the trouble we see around the world. And what opportunities are there in each of you as you see it for two-eyed seeing to help us get back to that nation-to-nation, proper nation-to-nation relationship? I mean, the government of Canada is committed to it. They don't seem to have any idea how to go about it. How could two-eyed seeing contribute to this is my question. Deborah, I want you to, each of you, if you would, but, you know, I think you were almost, you seem to want to get to that question. You termed it as reconciliation.
I mean, my gut reaction to what you're saying, so thank you for your question. I actually really liked your summary of how you talked about this history very shortly, is I think that it's also in the TRC that I think maybe folks don't take as seriously as I could. I don't mean us, but I mean in terms of Indigenous knowledge systems. And the principles, it makes it very clear, like Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous legal orders, treaties, protocols, all of those have to happen in order for there to be any kind of reconciliation. But I think specifically to me, there's an obligation and a responsibility by the Crown, by governments, people who don't respect Indigenous peoples in the way that they want, whatever agreements there are, because not everyone has treaties, and not everyone's okay with what ended up kind of sometimes being understood as being negotiated. But they have responsibilities and obligations to step up and support. They can't just say, okay, Indigenous people, come to the table as equal partners when people are dealing with multiple crises in their communities, right? Like, that's just not a fair thing to be putting on Indigenous peoples without supporting them to be able to in a lot of cases, as Jacquie and Andrea pointed out, that people are also learning too, right? So how do you support this? So I think that there has to absolutely be support in order for two-eyed seeing to kind of be a reality. Indigenous knowledge does have to be equal. Not only equal, has to be kind of supported, right? Because when I think about universities, there's way more money, way more research being pumped into science than there ever is into anything in relation to Indigenous knowledge. It's not equitable at this time. And so there needs to be support in order for Indigenous knowledges to be able to flourish. And that's, I don't think that's happening in the way that it should be happening, and not in a way that should be supporting communities. Now, people call this, self-determination and research, so that our questions and our knowledge can support what we want our future to be based on our terms, our questions in the way that we want. And science can be very helpful for us to help to realize those kind of goals and aspirations. But really, in my view, Indigenous knowledge systems, not just knowledge, but the whole systems that support it, has to be supported in order for two-eyed seeing to kind of work. Like, you need people who actually have this knowledge. It's not going to work if people don't have this, right, and it's not being passed on to future generations. A couple things. One is Indigenous knowledge systems is more of a verb than a noun. It's something that you do, like ways of doing. It's something that you do. So people need to be supported to be able to be doing this. The other thing is that Indigenous knowledge lives within people and communities. It's not appropriate to extract this. So you need to work with people and communities in order to work with Indigenous knowledge systems. But those have to be upheld, and they need a lot more support in order for things to be equitable. Because I think individually, maybe in our projects we work on that, but in terms of how things are funded, who's getting funded, how much money gets pumped into, let's say, NSERC or CHR compared to SHRC, like it's not equitable. It's not equitable at all. I probably went off on a tangent, didn't answer your question, and took up way too much space, so apologies for that. But happy to have these conversations, more of these conversations as well. But it's a good question.
Very helpful.
Very rich answers. Jacquie or Andrea, is there anything that you wanted to add on this nation to nation question? Jacquie?
Yeah, I'll just add something very briefly. In thinking about nation to nation relationships, but also, again, like Deb said, relationships with the land as well should be something that should be in that discussion. And I guess I can come from a wildlife ecology perspective and say that, we are faced with some pretty important environmental issues today. For example, biodiversity is collapsing. And, there's many examples of how two-eyed seeing and similar frameworks can help us better understand and address these issues. Address species declines, for example, engage in conservation. So with ways that we interweave ways of knowing, like two-eyed seeing, and ensuring that we're doing it in a good way, by being respectful to one another and being inclusive and diverse in science and in the work we do with wildlife ecology as an example, we can start building really great partnerships that are respectful one another, but like Deb was mentioning, like the two-row wampum, that are respectful of each other, working together for the greater good of the river or the environment. So in building these partnerships that will have hopefully equal seats at the table, we can, engage in joint decision making for things in my field, things like, for example, wildlife or environmental monitoring and management. So I think there is a bit of a way. I would say that every journey begins with a single step. And we have taken these steps and we are reconciling ways of knowing. And I think that bettering nation to nation relationships, we have a long way to go, but we are on a path to getting there. And it's really exciting to be part of this.
Thanks, Jessie. Andrea, do you have a quick comment on this as well?
Yeah, I'll try to keep it quick, Jackie. I know we're mindful of the time.
Thank you.
But I really like how you phrased that, Miles, in terms of how things are manifesting now. And I think like what we're seeing currently in Mi'kma'ki with the lobster fishery, I think that's a pretty prime example of how our failure to reconcile ways of knowing and being is manifesting today. And so we're getting to a point, as Jessie alluded to, where we're not going to have much of a choice in how we move forward. We need to do something now before it's too late. And that's very much the reality through my salmon-centered view of the world. But I really think it requires a fundamental shift in how we grow up through the education system. I think like I hear time and time again that people feel like they're lacking the tools, the capacity to speak about these things. People are scared to engage, scared to make a misstep. And just like Jessie said, this is like a one step at a time thing where we're starting to gain knowledge of how to move through these things in the right way. But the more that we can get this into people's vernacular at an earlier stage in life, I think
I'm seeing Andrea frozen.
Yeah.
I don't know if anyone else is.
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
I thought maybe it's just me.
Yeah. Sorry, Andrea. I think you've frozen. Maybe we'll come back to you on the next round. And I'll just turn to Nancy quickly. Nancy, as one of our conveners, do you have a quick comment or question for and before I ask you, I just wanted to make a note that I think we'll try to extend a little bit longer so we can get to audience questions as well. We're running a little bit behind, but I want to also take the time to get yours and Dave Kershane's questions or comments. So over to you, Nancy.
Thank you so much, Jackie. And I want to thank also Elder Dr. Dave Kershane and our wonderful panelists. This has been an amazing conversation for me. So much wisdom that has been shared and experiences and insights that I think will resonate for a long time to come. I was so happy to learn about a new word, Etuaptmumk, for two-eyed seeing, and thinking about the role of language and all the dozens of Indigenous languages that are spoken across our country, and the wisdom that's embodied in words like Etuaptmumk. And I can think of many others, Nuchannel, Tishukish, Tsawak, and so many other words that embody a very complex knowledge just in themselves, and thinking that it would be so important for Canadians more broadly to learn some of these words and to respect the languages that embody the knowledge much more. And that's all I'll say as a comment, and maybe some of you want to react to that. But thank you so much again for that amazing collective presentation.
Thank you, Nancy. Jesse, Andrea, or Deb, did you want to make a quick response to Nancy? Great. Yeah. I'll just say very quickly, Nancy, as a settler, I totally agree with you. I'm really honored right now to be taking a Hulkaminum class, which is what I'm going to turn to in a few minutes when we wrap up. And I think there are more and more resources available to people to be learning the languages at institutions in their regions. And I encourage it. So next I'll turn to Elder Dr. Dave Kershane. Dave, do you have any comment or question that you'd like to add at this point?
Thank you, Jackie. I would like to thank the presenters for sharing their words today. You know, I'm just reflecting on what they're sharing with us. I think that this is one way that we can find an understanding of working together, that to be able to meet the current challenges that we have, that's going to probably be one of our biggest challenges, is to be able to find that spirit, to be able to go beyond our own differences and to find that common vision where we're able to support each other in what each of us are able to bring, so that we can create a path that really is the path of our ancestors. It's only been in more recent times that as Indigenous people, you know, we find ourselves receiving a little more attention with the Western world, who are, you know, some are taking the opportunity to listen, you know, to what the Indigenous people are saying. And it's the knowledge keepers of our people, you know, who are the knowledge holders of a way of life that can really lay a foundation of how we can survive as human beings. And part of the challenge, of course, is to be able to find ways to work together. And when we look at the current environment that Indigenous people find themselves, it is an environment of domination, which is the root of the conflict, the misunderstanding, and the continued oppression of the people. And we are struggling to, you know, to try to give voice from spirit. And it's interesting that when we look at the concept or understanding of science, it is based on that you need to see before you believe. And that's not our world as a people. Our world is based on a relationship with spirit. And it says our understanding, it is only when you believe that you will see and appreciate the existence of that energy that we call spirit. And when we struggle today, you know, trying to find ways and means to create a better world, and we're challenged, how do we stop what we are doing by destroying the earth, by destroying the environment? And in the view of Indigenous people, our health and wellness begins with having a very close, sacred relationship with the land. And in hearing so many of our elders across the country, and they have reminded us the Creator gave the people everything in order to have a good life. Our people refer to it in our language as Minukimatisiwan, a good way of life that comes with duties and responsibilities, and how to reflect being a being of kindness. Our people have always, you know, recognized the symbol of the circle as a way of life, that what we put into that circle will be returned to us multiplied. And that is why we were encouraged, you know, to put nothing but kindness into that circle. And until the indigenous people find their rightful place in their homeland, reflecting their leadership, I find that we're going to struggle more and more to try to come to terms and with what we are doing to each other and what we're doing to the earth. Two-eyed seeing to me is two eyes seeing the truth of our existence, seeing the beauty in nature as she brings us teachings. You know, I've said many times that Mother Earth has an intelligence, and this is difficult for many people to understand, especially if one has not taken the time and the opportunity to hear the voice of the land, which is one of the strongest protocols of our people, to go to the land, to feel the land, and to hear the land as it speaks. And nature is constantly speaking to us, but we never take the time to be able to be open, to listen to the knowledge that is being shared, because that higher knowledge that we all seek is within the realm of spirit, which is why, you know, we are a people of ceremony. Ceremony connects us to that higher intelligence. So in prophecy, it was foretold that it would be here in our homeland that the indigenous people would find themselves propelled into the forefront of leadership and a movement that would help awaken all our brothers and sisters to the simple fact and truth that the earth is alive, whether people want to believe it or not. But the fact and the truth is, she is alive, she's a living entity. And what we need to do is to give more opportunity for the knowledge keepers of our people across the country that have the language, that have the knowledge, that have the understanding of that relationship with the land, that because ultimately that is where we're going to heal from the land itself. And we have to return that love that the land continues to give us. We have to reciprocate that love by acknowledging, you know, that she is alive, acknowledging that she has rules of conduct on how we should live and behave that are called natural laws. And these natural laws are self-enforcing. None of us have the power, you know, to change those laws. So I thank the, you know, the presenters today and their passion, you know, for them, you know, seeking also, you know, their place, their purpose in their own life when it comes to the challenges that we collectively face as humanity. You know, are we going to reach that level that the grandmothers and the grandpas have told us? Be kind, use kindness in your life, be kind to the land, be kind to each other. And it is so simple. But what has happened, we put all our dependency on ideologies, concepts, and systems that we know are destroying, you know, the very environment that our children will need to live, you know, on this beautiful place that we call Mother Earth. So I thank the presenters for giving up their time today. Miguel.
Thank you, Dave. So we have several questions that have come in from the audience. And at this point, we're at about 10 o'clock Pacific, which was, at this point, we'll try to wrap up in about 10 minutes if we could, because we're a little over time. And I know that our speakers have some other commitments. So we'll wrap up some of the questions together in like form. And first I'll just say, like, I've had a look at a number of the questions, and there are some ways that we can address some of them from the RWalk perspective. And so one of the questions was for a list of resources. And so our team has been gathering some resources together, and we're going to be working with the speakers to gather more. We'll endeavor to put a link to those in the email that we send out with the recording after the session, so that everybody can have access to those resources. And another very common question was for some more applied examples. And I think given the nature of the programming that we have coming up, which I'll comment on in a minute, and the time that we have, I think the best way to address that is to note that a core part of the the vision for this Reconciling Ways of Knowing initiative was to start off with our first couple sessions being foundational discussions for how to understand across ways of knowing, and then to shift into more applied examples. And so over the next month or two, we're going to be developing some plans for our programming for next year, which will be really a lot more focused on the applied examples. And so we'll return to that and hope to have Jacquie, Andrea, and Deb be parts of those discussions in the new year as well, depending on their availability. So we promise you more on that. That was originally part of the plan, and we do plan to get very applied in the new year. And so that being said, we'll shift to one of the key questions that came in, which is, how can we incorporate two-eyed seeing without appropriating it within currently settler-based education systems? How can we decolonize those systems? And this was a question that I had been hoping to ask you as well. So I'm really glad that it came up in the audience questions. And I might start with Jacquie.
Thanks, Jacquie. Yeah, there is a lot of work to do, and we are. This is a question too that comes up quite a lot in discussions that I hear or am a part of. So in institutions and in places that we work in, for example, I think there's a lot that we can do to decolonize and bring in multiple ways of knowing, bring in two-eyed seeing, for example. We need more opportunities, not just for our students though, but also for the teachers, for professors who are teaching, because we've kind of had this system where this wasn't taught to those people who are now teaching. So if we can have more opportunities available for individuals to take part in learning that way, I think is really good as well. And to be supportive of those who want to learn. I mean, when I was in school, like I felt a lot of barriers trying to do this on my own. I didn't have a lot of support, and I had to quickly realize that these barriers I was up against were only perceived barriers that we can overcome, and barriers that I overcame. And I'll just say quickly that we all have this fire within us, this fire to make change, and that fire is protected within us, and nobody can put that out. And so if we keep feeding that fire, and we can keep letting it burn bright, because our future generations depend on it. And just to say, I've heard this saying that I always wondered why somebody didn't do something about that. And I realized I am somebody. So we are all somebody. Yes, there are huge changes that need to happen in our institutions, in our workplaces, but we can all contribute to making change. And just by being here today and listening to these conversations, I feel like we're all contributing to this change. So there's a lot to be done, but we can do it together. And I'm really excited and to be in with so many like-minded people on this journey together.
Thanks, Jacquie. We've just had Elder Albert Marshall join us. So Albert, I just wanted to recognize that you've been able to join us now and say hello and welcome. And we'll come back to Elder Marshall in a moment. Andrea, I'll just turn to you and ask if you have any comments that you want to add about how we can do two-eyed seeing without appropriating Indigenous knowledge within educational structures.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think that Jacquie really touched on it in terms of we need to make space for Indigenous teachers and leaders to be at the forefront of classrooms and this learning. But I think also tying back to what Robin Wall Kimmerer said in the previous dialogue, I think that land-based learning is a really powerful tool in our toolbox to really employ both ways of knowing in tandem and to see it in practice and for it to feel concrete and for both of these knowledge systems to be held as equally valid in practice. And so that's something that I really try to do in my work. I lead science camps for youth in my nation where we do both at once. We talk about the importance of language and culture as equally important to our conservation measures for the fish, because they're all so deeply intertwined. And science education in particular is such a history of wanting everyone to specialize and to narrow in. And we do need specialists, but when everything in this world is so tightly interconnected, we also need holistic thinkers. And I think that land-based learning is a really wonderful way that we can build that holistic thinking into the next generation.
Thank you, Andrea. Elder Marshall, just wondering if you might like to just weigh in on this question. We've had a really rich conversation so far, and the question that we're talking about right now is about how can we draw on the idea of two-eyed seeing without appropriating Indigenous knowledge, and how can educational systems recognize two-eyed seeing without being knowledge appropriators?
Am I muted?
Nope, you're live.
Okay, so you can hear me. You can hear me quite well then.
We can.
Now I do apologize with all this technological jungle that I had to wade through. But anyway, this idea of two-eyed seeing, I think, first of all, I believe it's important to mention that two-eyed seeing, I think, if it's applied, has to be action-oriented. Because it has to be obvious that whatever initiative that we may be engaged into, there's always an opportunity for us to invoke or invoke another perspective. And if that perspective is somehow could be seen as not only as valid, but maybe something in which it might enhance or expand the perception of something, then I think it should become incumbent in all of us to make that effort as to how this can become an action oriented. Because right now, I believe in most cases, this concept of two-eyed seeing, even though people will not admit that they totally understand what it really implies or what it really says. So rather than ask for further clarification, they will just kind of assume that that concept will just kind of go away, maybe, or whatever. So, because I think it should, especially in the current dilemma we're in at this point in time, in which it should be obvious to all of us that there is a great need for some form of a transformative change, in which we really reflect and look back and see where we come from and how we got here, and at what expense have we actually created to create an imbalance with our natural world. And having acknowledged that, then I think it should become incumbent in all of us to make an effort that from here on forward, business cannot be as usual. We have to reflect into our past and really clearly see and identify where we come from and how we got here, and at the expense we have cost to this wonderful creation of ours. And that should propel us, or that should motivate us to make every concerted effort to ensure that this different perspective has to be 100 degrees different than what we had before, because our Earth Mother really needs us. We have allowed her. We have allowed her to for the environment to be completely compromised, air, water, and soil. And unless we accept that responsibility and do everything in our power to improve our ways, then I believe that we will then fail as humanity for the responsibility that we have been given because of something that we have that no other creature has, and that's a cognitive mind. Yes, this cognitive mind has created a monster for us. And this monster is what I would call this arm of destruction. But I believe this mind of ours could also transform that monster to be the arm of medication, of repairing and undoing some of the harms that we have done in the past. Unless we are committed to that idea, which I believe it's constantly encouraged and reinforced when we invoke our other lens, or 2I seeing perspective. Because again, 2I seeing perspective, I think, has to be in which there's some action for the better. I don't believe we have the luxury anymore to be continuously be comfortable in our denials, in our silences, in our inactions, because the rate of destruction is so rapid that she cannot heal herself, regenerate herself fast enough, and she cannot cleanse herself fast enough with the rate of chemicals in which is being pumped into her. Now, how much longer are we going to remain silent, inactive, and in denial before maybe it might be too late? This is where we Aboriginal people have been saying for years. Unless we commit ourselves of ensuring that no actions of ours will ever compromise the ecological integrity of the area or the cleansing, then we would then fail. We would have then failed to live up to our inherent responsibilities, because again, we have something that no other creature has, and that's that cognitive mind. So let's put that energy to work to be the helping hand, and not and stop her from being the arm of destruction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elder Albert Marshall, for joining us and for your reflections there. We really appreciate that. At this point, I'd just like to say there are a number of really rich questions that remain, but a number of our speakers have other commitments that we have to turn to, and I know that our audience does, and it's such a privilege to have Elder Albert Marshall be able to join us in the end, and really grateful to be able to hear from him. And I'm sure that I speak for all of the other speakers and participants in recognizing how honored we are to have had you join us, Albert. So in terms of the other questions from the audience, I'll just say that what our plan will be for addressing those is to address them in our future sessions. I'll just note like one particular question that stood out that I'd really like, as somebody involved in the programming development for our Reconciling Ways of Knowing initiative, is to talk about and to recognize that Indigenous knowledge belongs to Indigenous peoples, and there a number of people are aware of this and others might not be, and it's a good place to start to research if you aren't already aware. There's a principle called OCAP, which is ownership, control, access, and possession, which are starting points for recognizing that Indigenous knowledge belongs to Indigenous peoples. And the question is just to reflect on how to protect this knowledge. And I just like to recognize that I think that is an ongoing part of the discussion that Reconciling Ways of Knowing will be engaging in, and that is something that we'll endeavor to have a more fulsome conversation on in the new year. So wanted to recognize that, and the wonderful other questions that have come in, that we've taken note of them, and we'll be reflecting them in our future programming. At this point, I would like to turn to Elder Dr. Dave Crochane to ask if you would kindly mind closing our session off in ceremony, and then we'll move back to our host, Darren Ma.
Thank you very much, Jackie. I do want to acknowledge Albert and his passion for what we, are collectively doing is really not treating the earth the way that we should be treating it, which is really the motivation behind, the engagement that we're having with each other across the country. And whenever, prayer is done in ceremony, we also, acknowledge the spirit of the relationship that we have with nature. As small as we are in numbers, our numbers are increased, with the alliance with our brothers, the trees, the animals, the birds. And we walk in respect with all of life. And in keeping with that spirit of understanding, I want to, complete the session here in a very quick prayer, using the language. Language is how we are understood, by our great Creator, because it was a blessing that we have been given as a people to have a language that we can express our heart, the spirit that holds the original knowledge and teaching of how we should walk upon the earth. So I will do that acknowledgement in my language. Kijemanido, kinanako migo, nidea ke, kinanako migo. Nimishum situk edason danimor, kinanako minnenem, kinegego eji wichian, aningeni namutwechi, chonokitamang mi wait madizu, chibakama de mangenina went, pa chigangayatanishunabe, aningewin abimadizi, jensutamuat, ugunenda sheminupibatizu, kinegego kshagini nagain nishunabe. Midas nogum egaweza chigeta nishnabe. Chiganotan kewin anin minikejoin dagazit. Ani minikewin ejimini goes at chiknama get. With anin chi chibmosayang ma king. Chimigrats. Thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you, Elder Crochane, and thank you very much for the opportunity to moderate today. I'll turn it over at this point to our host, Darren Ma.
Thank you, Jackie, and Elder Dr. Dave Crochane for helping us open and close today's dialogue in a good way. Thank you, Elder Albert Marshall and Doctors Jesse Popp, Andrea Reid, and Deborah McGregor for generously sharing your knowledge. The Reconciling Ways of Knowing Indigenous Knowledge and Science Forum project conveners, the maestros of the Ways of Knowing technical team who make our dialogues run smoothly, and most importantly, everyone who joined us here today. I raise my hands to all of you. I would again like to thank our friends at the Canadian Mountain Network for their support in today's dialogue. You can learn more about their mountain system research projects at www.canadianmountainnetwork.ca. We will be sending out a brief survey shortly. Please take a few minutes to share your thoughts with us. The Reconciling Ways of Knowing online forum series will be continuing in the coming months and into the new year. Please join us as we visit the Victoria Virtual Forum on Thursday, November 12th to discuss how Indigenous knowledge can be used to endure and recover from the global pandemic. Additional information about this dialogue will be made available shortly. If you haven't already done so, please visit our website, www.waysofknowingforum.ca, to sign up for updates. And follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. And last but not least, our ability to plan and host these critical discussions would not be possible without your overwhelming support. Please tell your friends and colleagues about the Reconciling Ways of Knowing Indigenous Knowledge and Science online forum series. And if you are in a position to do so, please consider making a donation at www.waysofknowingforum.ca. Thank you.